is this whole Islamophobia and this fear of Muslims is really unhealthy. And what we need to do is we need to run in and we need to embrace them as people and understand that people get all freaked out about them, why they look different and they talk different. Whoa. I've traveled in Hindu nations and Buddhist nations and Muslim nations. I want to tell you something, a little secret that you probably all know, is that people are all the same.
Welcome to Church of the Rock from Winnipeg. Stay tuned to this week's thought-provoking message from Pastor Mark Hughes.
So here we are, we're at the pie auction once again, where we get together and we raise literally hundreds of thousands of dollars for the 1040 window and missions around the world. And we had so much fun last night when we did it for the first time. We had a couple drive from Carlisle, Saskatchewan, 4 hours one way. And when they got here, they paid $2,000 for a chocolate cake, put it in their car and drove back to Saskatchewan. They had seen it online and they didn't want to miss it. And that's what happens with this. Well, this year my message is entitled, The Last of the Giants. And of course, we know when you read the Old Testament, there were giants in the Old Testament. And if you want to know where they came from, you can go read the story in Genesis chapter 6. It's kind of creepy, actually. But you can go read it anyway. And you'll remember that when Joshua got into the promised land, there was giants in the land. And, like I said, you can find out where they came from. And he was supposed to get rid of all those giants. But even by the time of King David, he had not got rid of them all. And there were still some giants in the land. In fact, there was only 5 of them. It was Goliath and 4 of his relatives. And these were literally the last of the giants. And of course, you remember the story because Israel was at war with Philistine, and they were pitched in battle across this valley. And for 40 days, Goliath, the giant, had taunted the army of Israel. And of course, he was a big boy. He was 9 feet 6 inches tall. He was this enormous man, and he was challenging Israel. He says, send out your best man. We'll go mano a mano. I'll take whoever you want to send out. I'll take him on. Winner take all. And if I beat him, then you'll serve us forever. And if he can beat me, then we'll serve you forever. And this is what the scripture said. It said, all of Israel was dreadfully afraid and fled. All these soldiers, they all ran away. So this goes on for 40 days. Israel won't have anything to do. Nobody will step up. And then guess who comes by? He shouldn't have even have been there because David was actually the shepherd boy and he's supposed to be out keeping the sheep. But he couldn't stand missing anything. So he brings some food for his brothers. And so here he comes, little Bo Peep, along with his sheep. And he comes along and his brothers are a little surprised to see him. And he says, so what's going down in the hood, yo? And he wants to know what's going on. So they explain to him what's going on. And this is what comes out of David's mouth. Imagine this. He's under 20 years old because he's not a soldier yet. And so out of his mouth comes this. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that defies the armies of the living God? A, that's kind of nervy. And B, it's getting kind of personal, right? I mean, that's hitting below the belt. And I mean, it's kind of ridiculous. This guy's a giant. He has this huge spear and this huge shield. And David's this little shepherd boy. And he says, well, you might have a shield and a sword and a javelin, but I got a little something on my own. And see, for the Jewish people, the circumcision was important because that was the evidence that they were in covenant with God. So that's why he's taunting him with this thing. So here we are. We're going to pick this story up in 1 Samuel chapter 17. So I've given you the prelude to the story. So here it is, verse 40. It says, talking about David, then he took his staff in his hand and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones. Say 5 smooth stones. From the brook, and he put them in his shepherd's bag in a pouch which he had, and his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. So the Philistine came and began drawing near to David, and the man who bore the shield went with him. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and good-looking. So the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you should come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine came to David, "Come to me, and I'll give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." Then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword and with a spear and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of the hosts, of the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defiled. And this day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Then all the assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's." Say, the battle is the Lord's. "And he will give you into our hands." And so it was, the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, and David hastened and ran. Say, hastened and ran. He hastened and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. Then David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone, and he slung it and struck the Philistine in the forehead, so that the stone sank deep into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no stone in the hand of David. Say, there was no stone. No sword. Thank you, Keith. No sword. No sword in the, say no sword in the hand of David. There was no stone either, because he had already slung it into his head. But thank you for correcting me on that. Nevertheless, I don't want you to miss this story. I mentioned these particular things because I want you to see the strategy that David employed to take on the last of the giants. And he brought 5 smooth stones because of the 4 brothers or cousins or whoever they were that were also giants. And what we find out about this story is that it is a little bit of a symbol as to how we are to deal with our world in evangelism. See, Jesus gave us a very daunting task about world evangelism. He said this. He said, "Go into all the world and make disciples of all..." What? Nations. Make disciples of all nations. So every nation, every people group in the world is what he said. And then if you didn't catch it that time, he said it again. And then he said this. He said, "This will be the sign of the age." He said, this gospel of the kingdom will be preached to all nations, and then the end shall come. So Jesus is not returning until this gospel is preached to all nations. And I know when you look around the world, you think, how's that possible? How is that possible that every man, woman, and child on this planet could hear the gospel? It does not seem possible. Well, how many think that it looked possible when Joshua led the children of Israel into the promised land full of giants? That didn't look possible. How many think that this didn't look possible when David went up against a 9-foot, 6-inch giant? It didn't look possible. But what we discover is the battle is the Lord's. Here's what the giants are, I think, that we're facing today. They, as far as our task of world evangelism, they are Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, atheism or non-religious kind of groups, which is probably a billion people. And then this one that I would call materialism, and I'm not talking about scientific materialism, I'm talking about secular materialism. I'm talking about this bankrupt religion of the West, particularly North America, where people need to buy things to make themselves feel like they have some worth, this consumerism. That's a whole message for another day, right? Because we're going to be talking about the 1040 window. And I want to show you on the screen, here's the 1040 window. The 1040 window is this little strip between the 10th north and 40 degrees north throughout Africa and Asia. And if you look at that little picture there, you can see that's the least evangelized place in the entire world. 50% of the world's population lives in the 1040 window, 80% of the world's poverty, and 93% of the unreached peoples are in the 1040 window. But here's the ironic part of it. Only 7% of the church's budget worldwide goes to the 1040 window. And so at Church of the Rock, years and years ago, we decided we're not going to do that. We're going to do the opposite. We're going to go after this, and we're going to raise money. And over the last number of years, we've contributed somewhere in the range of $500,000 to evangelism in the 1040 window every single year. David did his part. God did the rest. He actually said, I'm not going to take you out. The Lord is going to fight this battle for me. And that's the thing for us to remember. And if you look through history, you see God working in profound ways like this. I'll give you a couple of real quick examples. The first one would be China. You know, 100 years ago, China was almost 100% Buddhist. Almost 1 billion Buddhist people living in China. And then what happened in 1949 was the Cultural Revolution. And Mao Zedong came to power. And Mao Zedong actually wanted to employ the tenets of Marxism, of Karl Marx, and create this communist nation. And in doing so, he actually effectively destroyed Buddhism, which is sort of interesting. One of the things Mao did when he came, Chairman Mao, was he expelled all the Christian missionaries, he imprisoned the pastors, and he burned the Bibles and closed down the churches. And so all the missionaries had to leave in 1949 from China. And so for 27 years, Chairman Mao was in power, and in 1976 he died, and we didn't know what happened. We had no news from China as far as whether the church had survived or died or what happened. And so in 1976, there's this crack opened up, and people started going back into China to find out what was going on. And in 1949, when he shut it down, there was between 75 and 100,000 Christians in China. And when they went back in 27 years later, they didn't find 75 to 100,000 Christians. They found 75 to 100 million. The church had grown exponentially in this time with no pastors and no Bibles and no missionaries. Apparently God didn't need us. and he was doing his work. And see, God can do this. He doesn't really need us. Now, he's telling us to do our part, but he'll do the rest. Another great example, actually, is South Korea. In 1900, South Korea was almost 100% Buddhist and 0% Christians. Today, South Korea is somewhere between 1/3 and a half Christians. Somehow or another, God has moved incredibly in this nation, and he can do it. If he'll do it there, he can do it here. And all those, the reason I mentioned those nations is that both those nations are in the 1040 window. Here's the way I look at it, and you can agree or disagree. But when I look at these giants, when I look at Hinduism and Buddhism and Islam, all those other religions are on the run, except for Islam. Islam is the fastest growing religion in the world today. There's now 1.8 billion Muslims worldwide. And I think I would refer to Islam as the last of the giants. And here's the strategy that we find from David. David said that it made haste and ran in. And see, what was the rest of Israel doing? They were dreadfully afraid, and what? They fled, but David ran in. And see, here's what I think is important for us to understand, is this whole Islamophobia and this fear of Muslims is really unhealthy. And what we need to do is we need to run in and we need to embrace them as people and understand that you know, people get all freaked out about them, why they look different and they talk different. Whoa. You know, I've traveled in Hindu nations and Buddhist nations and Muslim nations. I want to tell you something, a little secret that you probably all know, is that people are all the same. Doesn't matter where you go. Doesn't matter what language they speak, what color they are. It doesn't matter how they dress. People are people. That's all they are. They're just people underneath the, you know, whatever they wear and however they look, whatever language they speak, and they've got the same dreams and aspirations as you, and most of them are kind and loving and peace-loving people that just want the best and just want to make a go in life. And what we do is we go and we brand them a certain way, and we're afraid of them. And let me lay you a little secret here. The only reason people hate each other in this world is because they don't know each other. And as soon as you get to know people, all of a sudden everything changes. Do you believe that? Yeah. You know, this whole thing, you say, well, Pastor Mark, don't you know? There's radicalized Islamic terrorists out there. Yeah, like there's no radicalized terrorists of any other religion. Are you kidding? Are you kidding? Look at the world. It doesn't matter what race or what culture you're from. There are terrorists in every people group. Look at what just happened down in New Zealand. That was a white guy that went in and mowed down 50 Muslim worshipers in the middle of their service. And thank God that the Jews and the Christians joined the Muslims in condemning that act and sharing in their grief in that moment, because it was a horrific thing, the worst mass murder in New Zealand history. And you see, if we would begin to understand that Jesus said, they will know you are my disciples by what? By your love. There's 2 million refugees that are living on the border of South Sudan in refugee camps. They have very little food. They have no prospects for life. It's just a complete humanitarian disaster. They're here. They have nowhere to go. They have no real homes. And so Frank and Rachel decide, of all places in the world, they're going to go live on the border of South Sudan. And then what they did was they actually were able to convince two warlords. They are actually sheiks that own land, and they've been fighting each other for decades, these two groups. And these two Arab sheiks, they got them together and they said, would you agree to donate land together, and we will teach these people who are starving to death on the border, we will teach them to farm, and we'll show them how to feed themselves if you will agree in donating the land together. Do you know that those two sheiks agreed? And so as soon as we heard about that there was peace coming between these two warring factions, and these Christians were in the middle of it to teach them how to pursue sustainable development and to bring the gospel, we thought, we want to be part of that project. So that's the first thing, is we make haste and run in, not run away like Israel did. The second thing was this: there was no sword in the hand of David. And one of the biggest mistakes that we have made in the West is raising a sword against Islam. All you have to do is go study the history of this, and you'll discover this really, really fast. That the Crusades, which went on for 200 years, from about 1000 AD to 1200 AD, called these Holy Crusades, were anything but holy. And what their plan was to rid the Holy Land of the Muslims. It was one of the greatest disasters militarily of history, and did nothing but drive a wedge between these people. It didn't actually accomplish anything, and hundreds of thousands of people lost their lives, and there was nothing, as I said, biblical or holy or wonderful about it. It was just a complete disaster. And we continue to do this throughout history. And every time the West, or Europeans or whomever, attack the Middle East and attack Arab people, all it does is further the divide between us, and it doesn't help the cause. How can that possibly help us if you're trying to win people to Christ? You can't win people to Christ by killing them. You do get that, right? This isn't just me that sees this. I remember in 2003 when the U.S. invaded Iraq, I was on the record publicly opposing that war way before everybody else was, because I knew it would happen. I said, this will only escalate the violence. How can this do anything good for the gospel? And who would have known? I would have never predicted that it was the very thing that precipitated the development of ISIS. And you go read the history of this and you can discover this for yourself. Now everybody's condemning it because they look back and they realize it was a mistake. But they should have seen it as a mistake in the first place. So when we look at the year 600 AD, for example, there was no Muslims, there was no Islam. And there was a man born by the name of Muhammad in 570 AD, and he was an orphan, actually. So he was raised by his grandparents, and his grandparents died, and he was raised by his uncle. And he was born in Mecca, Saudi Arabia. And what happened was he traveled with his uncle, as I said, who was this traveling salesman type of person, or merchant. And he met all kinds of Christians, and he met all kinds of Jews, and he was influenced by whom he called the people of the book. And then when he was 40 years old, so it's now 610 AD, he was meditating in a cave, and he had a visitation by what he called a jinn, or an angel, or a demon. And his wife convinced him that this was the angel Gabriel, and he started recording the things that this angel told him, and that's where we get the Quran today. We have this book called the Quran, and a lot of Christians don't know this, was that Muhammad was not creating a new religion. He was actually taking Judeo-Christianity, and he thought he was correcting it, and he thought it was corrupt. And that's why the Quran includes many of the same themes as the Bible. There's an Adam, and there's an Eve, and there's a Moses, and there's a David. There's even a Jesus. They call him Isa, which is just the Arabic word for Jesus, but he's Jesus, and he's one of the prophets. And the whole story actually is predicated on what happened with Abraham. And we know the story of Abraham in Christianity. What happened was Abraham was promised a son, right? And his wife was old, and she couldn't have a baby. And after 10 years, she didn't have a baby. So Sarah, his wife, came up with this plan. This is her plan, so you can blame her. She said, Hagar, my maid, she's young and she's fertile. Why don't you impregnate her? Now, Abraham, being a guy, didn't need much encouragement. He said, okay, I'm in. so anyway, he gets Hagar pregnant, and then, of course, once she's pregnant, Sarah doesn't like the idea as much. And there's strife in the household, and she kicks Hagar out. And Hagar is sitting under a tree, and it says, the Lord appeared to Hagar and said, don't be dismayed, For you will bear a son, and his name shall be Ishmael, and he shall be a great people. Listen to this. And then they will multiply exceedingly, and his hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand shall be against him. This is right out of the Bible. And you look at the history of this. And so what happened was then he had another son who was Isaac, and of course Isaac was the one he sacrificed or was going to sacrifice on Mount Moriah. That's the biblical story. But Islam, what you read in the Quran, was that it wasn't Isaac that was sacrificed on Mount Moriah, it was Ishmael. And remember, Ishmael is the father of the Muslim people. And so their story diverges from our story. And that's why, and this is the craziest thing you'll ever see if you go to Israel, and you've all seen the pictures of it. That's why if you go to Mount Moriah, which is the location of the temple, which is the remnants of Herod's temple from Jesus' day, right smack in the middle, what do you find? The Muslim Dome of the Rock. Look at the picture. To think that Muslim temple is built right where the Jewish temple was. And they both claim this spot because they're both claiming to be descendants of Abraham. So you're beginning to catch this, aren't you? And so it says here that there was no sword in the hand of David. And this is important for us to understand, that we are never going to win this thing as a military operation. It'll never happen. That's the symbolism that we need to get a hold of. And then the last thing I pointed out to you was this. It said that he took 5 smooth stones. He didn't come. See, Goliath came with spear and sword and javelin. And he came with 5 smooth stones, not pointy objects, not even deadly objects typically. And yes, I know that he killed Goliath. We'll just leave that aside for a moment. I want you to look at the symbolism of this, of going in with 5 smooth stones. Going in with a gentle touch is the way I want you to see this. All right? And here's what the 5 smooth stones are. I'm going to throw them all up at once. They're Bible translation, church planting, humanitarian aid, video production, and leadership development. So one of the big things we do in the 1040 window is we do Bible translation for people who do not have a Bible in their own language. We're in Kenya, we're in Burkina Faso, we're in India, we're in Pakistan, Afghanistan. And there's that little pink area there, which is kind of interesting. I want to take a moment and point that out. That's in northern China. And the people that live there are called the Hui people. And here's what's super surprising about the Hui people. I want you to look at those people for a moment. You can see, obviously, that they're of Chinese descent. My question for you is, what religion do you think they are? They're Muslims. They're Muslims living in China. They're a persecuted people, hated by the Chinese government because of their religion. There are 8.9 million of these people, and they don't have a Bible in their own language. And so Church of the Rock is involved in seeing that they're getting a Bible in their own language. And we're going to spend $195,000 this year putting Bibles into languages of people that do not have a Bible in their own language. And let me just share one little quick story about how important this is. So 2 days ago, I was at the Y working out. You don't look like this by sitting on the couch eating chips. And so I meet I meet this Chinese gal. And she's all excited to meet me. And she says, Pastor Mark, Pastor Mark. And she's all excited because she recognizes me from TV. And so I'm asking her story. And she came from Hong Kong about 20 years ago. And so I said, so you know who I am. So are you a Christian? She says, yes, I'm a Christian. I said, tell me how you became a Christian. I want to know. So she said, well, when I came to Canada, she said, coming from China, I didn't believe in anything. I was non-religious. I didn't have any faith. And she said, this Christian person gave me a Bible. Are you ready for this? In my native tongue. She says, I got a Bible in Cantonese. And she said, and that Bible sat on my bedstand for 9 years, and I never picked it up. And it's about sowing seed, right? And she said, after 9 years, I picked up the Bible, and I started to read it. And she said, all of a sudden, life made sense. All of a sudden, all the questions I had and who I was and why I was here and what and everything started to make sense to me. So she said, I became a Christian, and she says, I read the Bible every single day, and I listen to the preachers on television, and then she says, and I even listen to you. I thought, okay, not sure what that means. She was talking about how good the other ones were. She said, I even listen to you. Thank you. And so that's how important Bible translation is. The second thing we're doing is church planting. So all over the world, there is a need to plant churches, and we're going to contribute $68,000 to church planting. We're doing it in places like Vietnam and Cambodia and India and Ethiopia. Oh my goodness, it's such a hot spot right now for church planting. And here's what it costs. If you go look at the numbers, you can plant a church for $500 for a whole year. A church, you can run a whole church for $500 for a whole year. And so that means that last year we planted, Church of the Rock was responsible for planting 125 churches in the 1040 window. I know you're thinking, do those churches look like this? No, they don't look like this. A church is not a building, it's a people worshiping God together, right? You know that. For $68,000, we had over 20,000 people come to Christ last year. Do the math on that. That's $3 a person for a convert. Boy, is there a better deal going on anywhere in the world than that? I don't think so. The third thing is humanitarian need. So you can't bring people the gospel if they're starving to death. The gospel doesn't really help them. They have other needs. And one of the big problems in the world right now, of course, is happening in the refugee camps in Syria. Even with ISIS now basically eliminated, you know what? These refugee camps are full of ISIS widows and orphans. We have some people, women, that are willing to go in and minister to the Muslim women there. And so we thought, boy, that sounds like a project we want to be part of. Do you want to be part of that? Yeah. Because we're a part of that. We got involved with working against the sex slave trade in the world, which is, I think, one of the greatest crimes against humanity right now. There are more people in slavery in the world today than any time in history. Did you know that? So we're involved with the International Justice Mission, and here's a raid going on in the Philippines that we helped sponsor, and they went in, they closed down these brothels that were actually children and women that were actually sex slaves being held against their will, and these men were prosecuted, and there was at least 140 people that came out of the sex slave trade. And so you are changing life, people. You need to know that. Then we have the video production that's being produced in the Arabic language, and this is a very exciting thing, and it goes on YouTube and Facebook and the internet and TV in different places. So I want to tell you one quick story about this. So there's a man, his name was Akbar. He was a Muslim man. He was living in one of the cities in Pakistan. And so there was a movie playing, and he wanted to go see it, so he went to the theater to see the movie, and the movie was about Isa. Now, Isa, you and I know that that's Jesus. That's the Arabic name for Jesus. And it was the story in Arabic about Isa. And he's watching this movie with actors from his own country in his own language. He's watching this movie, and he gets to the end of the movie, or near the end, which you would know this part, where they actually go and crucify Isa. And so they're putting the prophet up, and he had seen the miracles he had done. And this is what went through Akbar's mind. He said, I know what's going to happen now. Isa is going to call down fire from heaven and destroy his enemies. And imagine his surprise when Isa, Jesus, said, forgive them, Lord, for they do not know what they do. He was so blown away by the fact that instead of vengeance, he had compassion and he had forgiveness. And it was a defining moment, and he went on a journey to discover Christ, which he did. He became a Christian, and he changed his last name from Allah is great to Jesus is great in the Arabic language. And the last and the final stone, of course, is leadership development. You can't plant churches and do these things without developing leaders in these countries, and so we're involved in that as well. So this is a daunting task. We have these enormous giants and this enormous hurdles ahead of us. But I believe we can do it. You know why? Because the Bible says that the battle is the Lord's. The Bible says that this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached to all nations, and then the end shall come. Let's stand together. Hello, Mark Hughes here, and thank you for tuning in to this year's message, The Last of the Giants. We've been talking about this important project of the 1040 window and taking missions to the world. And if you'd like to get involved, it's the easiest thing. You just go to our website, hit on missions, and then 1040 window, and everything you give, 100%, we promise, will go to these projects in the 1040 window. So thank you for partnering with us. God bless, and we'll see you next time.